Jaden Harris walked through the city with shoes that had seen more miles than most cars on the highway. Soles patched 3 times with tape and glue, heels worn flat, laces mismatched because one had snapped months ago. Every step carried the weight of a life most people never saw, a life where every coin mattered, every chore counted, and every dream felt a size too big for his circumstances. The early morning wind stung his cheeks as he crossed the road toward the citywide bank, a place he'd only ever entered to cash small checks from sweeping barbershops, cleaning yards, and stocking shelves at the corner store. Inside, adults in suits moved with expensive confidence, marble floors gleamed, and the air smelled faintly of coffee that cost more than Jaden's breakfast. He held tight to his small backpack and approached the counter hesitantly. Today wasn't about cashing a check. Today was about checking something more important, a promise his mother made him keep. For 3 years, every dollar Jaden earned that didn't go toward food or school supplies went into a battered envelope under his bed, and every few months he'd come in and deposit whatever he could. He had no idea what the total was now, he only knew it was everything. But as he stepped up, ready to finally see the reward for years of sacrifice, the bank manager swaggered over, drawn by the sight of a poor kid in worn-out clothes and dust-covered sneakers. The manager's eyes narrowed, not in concern, but in condescending curiosity. This wasn't the kind of customer he thought belonged in his polished branch. "This line is for account holders," the manager said sharply, as though delivering a warning rather than answering a question. Jaden swallowed his nerves and replied that he did have an account, the smallest whisper of pride flickering in his voice. But the manager only smirked, glancing at the boy's shoes and the fraying hem of his jacket. "Sure you do," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a couple of people in line to hear. Snickers floated behind Jaden as heat flushed his face, but he stood firm. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to see what hard work and hope could build. The manager's name was Richard Banks, a man who lived up to his last name. Not because he understood people, but because he understood numbers and imagined they told the full story. He motioned Jaden over to his desk, more to rush him away from the main line than to help. "All right," Richard said with exaggerated patience. "Account number?" Jaden opened his backpack and carefully pulled out a notebook that had doubled as a diary, ledger, and dream board. Inside the front cover was a photocopy of his account slip, crinkled and soft at the edges. Richard sighed as though time itself was being wasted while he typed slowly, too slowly for someone paid to do the job daily. He halfway expected the system to pop up a warning that there was no such account, or worse, that the balance was next to nothing. The screen loaded. Richard's smirk deepened. "Let's see what we're working with here," he mumbled, spinning the monitor slightly toward himself. But the moment the numbers flashed, his eyelids jerked open, his jaw loosened, and he instinctively leaned back as if the screen had spit the truth at him too hard. He refreshed the page. Same number. He clicked the transaction history. Dozens of deposits, tiny yes but consistent, relentless, disciplined. Then came the final line item, an unexpected transfer from a charity organization Jaden had volunteered with over the summer, one that awarded scholarships secretly to teens who showed grit instead of asking for handouts. The balance of 48,212.16. A boy who looked poor enough to be pitied had saved more than many adults with suits and briefcases. Richard stared, unable to speak, as his entire assumption collapsed in seconds. Jaden, who had thought maybe he had a few thousand saved, blinked in shock at the figure when Richard finally rotated the screen. Tears welled, not because of the money itself, but because every late night, every skipped snack, every time he chose work over sleep or play, it all meant something bigger now. The manager stood up and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Harris," he said, using Jaden's last name now as though speaking to royalty. Would you like to speak in my office about account options?" The same people who had snickered earlier heard the tone change and turned to stare, eyes wide, jaws slack. Jaden exhaled and felt taller than he ever had, not because of money, but because respect had finally arrived. Jaden walked out of the bank not with new shoes, not with flashy bills in hand, but with possibility shadowing his every step. The manager had practically tripped over himself offering savings plans, investment options, and college-bound advice, but Jaden accepted only what aligned with the blueprint he had scribbled on notebook pages for years. He wanted a future his mother could be proud of, one that honored her sacrifices. The nights she worked double shifts. The mornings she left messages on the fridge telling him not to give up. The quiet strength she carried like armor. As Jaden stepped into the sunlight, kids on scooters zipped past him. People rushed to work. The city buzzed. But for him, the world slowed. He tightened his backpack strap, looked down at the shoes that had carried him through storms, literal and emotional, and whispered a silent promise that one day he'd retire them in a glass box, not throw them away. Because these shoes had walked him from scarcity to possibility. Word spread fast, first inside the bank, then through whispers, then through the neighborhood where everyone had seen Jaden hustling rain or shine. Kids who once laughed at his old shoes now asked how he did it. Adults who doubted him nodded respectfully. And Jaden didn't brag, he simply shared the truth. Small steps add up if you keep taking them. As the city lights flickered alive that evening, Jaden thought deeper. His story wasn't about money. It was about never letting the world decide your worth based on what you wear, what you look like, or where you start. His journey was just beginning. He promised himself he'd come back to the bank one day, not as a deposit-making kid, but as someone who could teach others how to build a life brick by brick. And as he passed a street light, he whispered the same message he hoped others would hear: dig. Work steady. Don't stop. He stepped forward, shoes whispering against concrete, not worn out anymore, but legendary. Jaden went home that night floating between disbelief and purpose, the number from the bank stamped into his thoughts like a brand of hope. His neighborhood didn't change as he walked through it. The cracked sidewalks still swallowed rainwater. The street lamps still flickered, as if arguing with the darkness. And the grocery store still smelled like frying oil and too much salt. But something in Jaden had shifted forever. When he pushed open the front door of the small apartment he shared with his mother, the real emotion hit him all at once, tidal and unstoppable. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table in her faded scrubs, exhaustion clinging to her like another layer of clothing. When he told her what the screen had shown, how the bank manager had laughed and then nearly fainted, how the number was bigger than both of them had imagined, she didn't gasp or scream or collapse. She just closed her eyes, pressed her hand against her heart, and let the tears roll silently. She didn't cry for the money. She cried because her son finally saw the proof of what she always believed he was capable of. And sat together and celebrated not with cake or takeout, but with leftover soup and whispered dreams, college, a business, maybe a house one day, where the ceiling didn't leak every spring. Jaden pulled out his notebook and drew a line through the first goal on his list: save enough to matter. But the next goal loomed even larger: multiply it. He had seen too many kids get their hands on money and lose it just as fast, swallowed by impulse or carelessness. He swore he would be different. That night, Jaden opened his laptop and watched videos on investing, compound interest, and scholarships. He read articles until his eyes burned and took notes until his pencil smudged the paper. While his friends slept or scrolled or wasted time on things that faded quickly, he studied how money worked, because to him, that balance wasn't an ending, it was a key. As the moon climbed higher, Jaden started to imagine a version of himself 10 years in the future. Not a kid scraping coins together, but a man who could break cycles instead of surviving them. He went to bed with his shoes still by the door, battered and proud, like warriors resting before their next battle. Weeks passed, and the ripples of Jaden's revelation spread wider than he expected. The same bank manager who once dismissed him began calling occasionally to ask if he needed assistance, and every time Jaden politely declined, he wasn't rude, he just knew that opportunities built with sweat meant more than favors offered out of shame. At school, the whispers eventually turned into awe. Teachers who hadn't noticed him before asked him to speak to after-school clubs about budgeting and saving. Friends who joked about his old sneakers now asked him how to open their first accounts. Jaden didn't hoard what he learned. He shared it the way people share directions for escaping a maze. But the real test came when he faced his first temptation. A flashy new store opened across town selling the very shoes he had dreamed of: clean soles, custom colors, names stitched in the side. For a moment, the old longing surged in him, the desire to walk into school wearing something new, something that wouldn't make people stare or snicker. The money was there. He could buy 10 pairs without blinking. but his mother's voice echoed in his memory. Just because you can afford something doesn't mean it's worth the price. He stood outside the store, hands in pockets, watching people parade in and out with bags full of things they didn't need. He turned away smiling, knowing his time would come, not with one pair of shoes but with a life where he didn't have to choose between pride and survival. Instead, he spent the afternoon at the library drafting a plan to start a small neighborhood tutoring and lawn care business, recruiting younger kids who needed purpose, who needed to see that earning didn't have to mean struggling alone. Jaden wanted to be more than an exception, he wanted to be a catalyst. His first client was Mrs. Whitaker, who paid him to mow her grass and then donated books for kids he was teaching. Soon, Saturdays became workdays, weekdays became lesson days, and Jaden slowly transformed from a boy counting pennies to a leader planting seeds. People still looked at his worn shoes, but now they saw something else behind them: momentum, direction, destiny. And as he lay awake one night staring at his bedroom ceiling, he knew his story wasn't merely about saving money or proving the bank manager wrong. It was about writing a legacy brick by brick until his shoes, no matter how old, walked streets he once only daydreamed about.